So there's a new CBA. We should probably talk about this, right? Let's get into it. Folks, I've been doing this long enough and old enough now that I remember when we used to tell time on the hockey beat based on how many labor stoppages we had been a part of. And so the recent announcement, first they announced it just prior to the NHL draft, and then we finally got the documentation in hand just this week of a 4-year CBA extension locked in over a year before the current CBA expires. It's kind of unprecedented, and it's exciting, and it's important. And let me just tell you a bit before we get into the details as to why it's so important. So, as I mentioned, we used to tell time based on labor stoppages, and we appear to be entering the end of a period of prolonged labor unrest in the National Hockey League. In the early 90s, there was a players' strike. That was followed a few years later by an owner's lockout at the end of a CBA. They lost half a season. Then, very infamously, the 2004 Flames Stanley Cup final run, where the Flames lost in Game 7 of the Cup final and seemed to be, potentially set up for a lot of success coming out of that run. That was followed by a year-long lockout that cost the NHL the entire 04-05 season, and that was followed by another CBA. That CBA was followed up by another half-season lockout, and the sunsetting of that CBA just happened to coincide with a pandemic and the COVID-19 stoppage, and that led to the NHL, the NHLPA really sitting down and hammering out what they needed to do to make hockey survive a pandemic. And then that led to the current CBA, which expires next year. And so this is kind of unprecedented. So the CBA, for those of you who are unfamiliar, it's the rules of the game for how players and teams and players in the league interact. And there's rules within the league for what teams need to do in terms of what rules they need to adhere to. But in terms of the individual players as laborers, essentially, this impacts everything: how they're treated, how they're paid, when they have to work, when they can't work, everything. And so it's a really important document, and there have been a bunch of changes made as part of this negotiation, which are big and small, and they have a lot of ripple effects, both league-wide and for the Calgary Flames. So as we're getting into this, I'm a big CBA nerd, as you might imagine. If you've never watched any of my videos or any of my stuff, welcome. I'm sorry. We're going to get into some of the details because I think some of the details are really important, really interesting, and I'll try to explain a bit as to why I'm so excited about these changes and why I find them interesting and what the implications are. So without further ado, let's delve into the 2026 to 2030 CBA extension. Now, before we get into it, just a word of warning: the CBA is long and complex, and there's actually, at present, no one CBA document. The current CBA consists of the 540-page CBA from 2013, which was amended by the Memorandum of Understanding from 2020, which is another 71 pages. That was, in turn, amended by a 167-page MOU that was just released by the NHL and the NHLPA, amending both of them. So the baseline is the 2013 CBA, and it's many parts, but we've sort of scaffolded the 2020 MOU and then the 2025 MOU on top of it. They're in the process of turning it all into one mega document. We don't know how long it's going to take. It's up to the lawyers. It'll take a while. And for those of you in the league office dealing with all this headache, we salute you, because the amount of language you're going to have to nitpick over and smooth out, it is no one's cup of tea, and we're glad you have to do it, and we just have to deal with the aftermath. So without further ado, let's get into the changes that the National Hockey League and the NHLPA have negotiated coming out of the 2025 MOU. First of all, generally speaking, my big takeaways from the document are they're just trying to standardize some things. If you're someone who has followed the NHL of the last few years, and there's some quirks in the CBA that folks like myself have to explain. Some of the inconsistencies were kind of weird, and they've done what they can to fix them, for lack of a better term. Here's an example. So prior to this extension, and prior to this extension coming into force on September 16th of 2026, how long the team that drafted you held your rights is depending on what league you were drafted from, and then whether or not you went into college. And that's kind of weird. So starting in 2026, as in starting with the 2027 NHL entry draft, which will be the first entry draft during the CBA period, it's all going to be standardized. It's all going to be based on the age you were when you were drafted. So if you were, they call it CBA draft age, the age you were on September 15th of your draft year. If you were 18 on September 15th of your draft year, your drafting team holds your rights for 4 years. If you were 19 or older, it's 3 years. And they've also included the same kind of rights extensions for any players that go to college after being drafted, then stick around in college, for the long haul. So, you won't lose your draft rights all of a sudden, but it's a bit more standardized. The language in that part of the CBA is much less complicated now, and it's much more standardized. And instead of having to have a weird flowchart of when your rights last until, it's simple. And simple is good. Simple is easy to understand. Similarly, the entry-level contract language is being standardized a bit. And so, generally speaking, you're eligible to sign an entry-level contract when you're 18 as soon as you're drafted, and then going forward. And the terms of your entry-level deal depend on your age. Except if you're European. It's weird. Basically, if you're a North American player, if you signed your entry-level deal aged 18 to 24, there were certain restrictions. 25 and older, none. If you weren't subject to the entry-level contract restrictions, you could basically sign any contract you want for any length you want. So there's no rookie salary cap, there's no minimum salary, there's no minimum length or maximum length, no restrictions whatsoever. But if you're a European, between the ages of 25 and 27 when you signed, it was an entry-level deal, a one-year entry-level deal with a bunch of restrictions. That's kind of weird. It's kind of weird that being a European or a North American player suddenly made you subject to different rules. So that's changed. It's all standardized now. So North American players and European players signing entry-level deals are subject to the exact same rules as each other, which is good. Similarly, the NHL used to have kind of weird rules for emergency backups, e-bugs. Every team had to have an e-bug available, but it was kind of the rules around them were kind of wonky, and you'd have one e-bug in each building for both teams. That's kind of weird. It led to David Ayers playing for Carolina, for example, and so they're standardizing it. So basically now there's a bunch of rules. We'll throw them up on screen. But essentially, emergency backups need to be approved by the NHL Central Registry before the season, and then 24 hours, I believe, before each game. I think it's if there's changes, but it might just be you have to tell them every game, hey, Calgary's e-bug is this guy, and that person, once they're approved, will practice with the team and travel with the team. So it's essentially they're a full-time player. They're not subject to entry-level contract rules. It's basically someone who's just on call. It's meant to be for emergency. It's not like you're just stashing a very good player, your third best goalie, as a practice goalie. Your third best goalie will be in the American League. But it's a way of sort of making something that was a little bit weird and idiosyncratic and sort of a weird hockey thing a little bit more structured and a little bit more centralized and a little bit less terrifying for the teams involved. Because, again, David Ayers was to steal a phrase from Steve Dangle, a Zamboni driver that worked for the Leafs, and he played for the Carolina Hurricanes and beat the Leafs. And that's kind of weird. So if you were Carolina, you probably don't want to have to rely on whoever's around as the e-bug in Toronto in that situation. And similarly, if you're Toronto, you probably don't want your practice goalie being made available to the other team in event of injury. So it's all standardized now, and that's kind of cool. We still have the fun, weird e-bug energy, but it's a little bit more structured now than it was, and hopefully we can still have the wacky fun, but with a little bit less terror involved in terms of teams being terrified of guys being put into weird situations. So again, that's kind of a cool thing. All right, some other things that were put into the CBA. The regular season starting in 26-27 will be 84 games. There'll be 42 home games and 42 away games. For the Flames, that means in the final season at the Saddledome, they get one extra home game. Just kind of fun, one extra time to say goodbye to one of the cooler buildings in the league. As a trade-off, the preseason, which was previously 8 games, is now down to 4 games. And veteran players, which they're categorizing as players who've dressed for 100 or more NHL games, including as a backup goalie, they're limited to 2 preseason games per season. So there's still an opportunity for young players to get reps in preseason games. And there's still the ability to make sure that your veterans aren't playing a bunch of preseason games for no reason getting hurt. So it's kind of fun. And I believe there's still... to the best of my knowledge, they didn't amend the veteran player language for the preseason. We'll double check on that. But again, the idea is the preseason, you don't want to just sort of have a bunch of random guys from the AHL team. You want to provide the paying customer with some NHL-ish players if you're paying the ticket prices. And so I think you're still going to see the same kind of roster restrictions, but I think you'll basically end up seeing probably, preseason games, especially the first 2, you're going to see kind of a mix of NHL and AHL guys, probably a 50-50 split, more or less. And then, again, as you kind of see now, more of an NHL-ish roster towards the end. And the nice thing is there's be less ramping up, so a lot of the games will seem more meaningful, for lack of a better term. One of the rules that I think a lot of people have been confused and frustrated by, especially if they work for NHL teams, they call it the regular recall restriction after the trade deadline. So under the current CBA, teams are limited to 4 non-emergency recalls after the trade deadline. The idea being that after the trade deadline, you can bring up as many guys as you need to meet roster minimums, but you can only bring up 4 guys from the minor league team in other circumstances. But they're called regular recalls. If you have a roster emergency, you might be short players and you can't fill out a roster, you can bring up guys as much as you want. Those are called emergency recalls. Regular recalls are anything that's not an emergency recall. So before you were limited to 4, they bumped it up to 5 with the restriction that you can only have 4 guys at a time on your roster on regular recalls. So I don't think it's really going to restrict much. Essentially, it's meant to, I think the spirit of the rule is protect veteran jobs. It's not, if your team's sort of circling the drain after the trade deadline, you don't want to just be able to bring up your whole AHL roster and just sort of, plunk a bunch of your veterans in the press box. You want to be able to sort of maintain an NHL roster and keep the guys that have been on the roster all season on the roster, unless they're injured. So that's the idea of the rule. Another thing that they've added is a restriction on retained salary trades. Currently, under the CBA, teams can, in a trade, retain up to half of the cap hit and the salary from a particular contract. And so we've seen so-called double retention trades where, it's a 3-way trade. Chris Tanev gets traded to a team that retains half. The Flames retain half the salary. The secondary team retains half again, 25% of the overall salary cap hit, and then trade him to a third team. In this case, that's what happened with the Flames with Dallas a couple years ago at the trade deadline. Dallas got Chris Tanev at 25% of his regular salary cap hit, and the middleman got a draft pick, and the Flames got a bunch of stuff. The league doesn't really like that. They don't really like the idea of teams using the salary cap essentially to buy draft picks. They would like the salary cap space to go towards, players who play on teams. So they're instituting within the season a 75-day restriction on a contract being part of a retained salary transaction. As in, if I have a contract, my contract can be traded and part of my salary retained once every 75 days. The regular season is typically between 185 and 192 days. It's been 192 the last couple of years because of the 4 nations and the Olympics and such things. And so if you're trading me at the trade deadline, which is about 40 or 42 days before the end of the regular season. That contract, if it's the same contract for the same player, can't be involved in another retained salary trade for 75 days, which would spill over into the next season. I can't be traded in a retained salary transaction for the first month of the next season, as long as it's the same contract. So, you can kind of see why they do that. It will probably slow down some of the complex trades we've seen. We won't see as many three-way trades because simply there's really no reason to have as many if teams can't retain salary twice. So it's kind of I get why they're doing it, but it seems like, I'm not sure if it was a big problem, but that's why they put in rules. Similarly, a restriction that will impact the Flames potentially is there's a new rule about paper transactions. So some teams, among them Calgary, Toronto, San Jose, have their minor league affiliate in the same city. It's nice because on your off days, you can send players down, your extra players, if they don't need waivers or if they've cleared waivers, you can send to the minor league team and save NHL cap space per day. It's kind of, it's not a ton, but if you're snuggled up against the salary cap, sending down your extra players, your healthy scratches on off days can allow you a bit of flexibility and potentially enough flexibility to add at the trade deadline when you otherwise might not be able to. Well, it's also kind of unfair to the players because potentially, especially if you're on a two-way deal, you'll go from making your NHL money to making a tenth of that in the American Hockey League. And so the new rule starting in 2026-27 is if you're going down, you got to play a game before you come back up. So it's essentially the spirit of the rule is if you're sending a player down to the minors, it's because they're going to play a game. And so if you have a guy who is a healthy scratch, the Flames did this with Dryden Hunt somewhat frequently in the last couple of years. Dryden Hunt was, for much of his tenure with the Flames last few years, the 13th or 14th forward on the roster. He might not have played consistently. So if you need to send him down to the AHL for a weekend, it's not just to save cap space. It has to be to play games. So a player would not be eligible to be called back up until he gets sent down to play a game. And so I kind of like it. It's from a cap perspective, you're restricting moves purely to save cap space, and you're protecting players a bit to make sure that if you're getting sent down to play rather than sort of just get sent down as an accounting thing. And so, yeah, if you're the Flames, potentially the Flames will be using their recalls and their call-ups a little bit differently. Maybe instead of, if you have one guy you're sending back and forth to save some cap space here and there, you might have two and you might rotate them because that, one of your guys won't be able to come back up until he plays a game. And so you might have a couple people rotate through as your extra call-up guy that might not have been doing it otherwise. But, it's meant to protect the players, and I kind of get the rule. It makes sense. Finally, the big changes are LTIR and the playoff salary cap. So, in a nutshell, the way it used to be is there was no salary cap whatsoever in the playoffs. Part of the reason is that the players technically didn't get paid their contracts during the playoffs. They were under contract, but they got paid per diem and out of a bonus pool. The further your team went in the playoffs, the more money your team splits between the players who played. And so that's kind of nice. It's an incentive structure meant to reward teams for playing further in the season. But because there is no salary cap, we've seen teams like Vegas, Edmonton, Florida, Tampa Bay. Tampa Bay famously, I think Nikita Kucherov wore a t-shirt that bragged about how much over the cap the Tampa Bay Lightning playoff roster was after they won the Stanley Cup. And people did not like that at all because it feels like you're violating the spirit of the cap. The spirit of the cap is meant to two things: cost certainty for the owners, but also competitive balance. Every team is allowed to spend the same amount of money. There's a minimum and there's a maximum. Everyone has to be in that band. And so it felt like an affront to the rule, the affront to the vestiges of competitive balance, to have teams be able to, somebody isn't on long-term injury reserve, so we're able to replace his cap with players up to a certain amount. oh wait, he's healthy again after once the playoffs start. So it's like you could basically get extra players, and extra cap space. It's much more complicated than that, but we don't need to get into the math of it. But needless to say, Mark Stone was injured for much of a season, and then the playoffs started. Mark Stone was eligible to play again. So Vegas had Mark Stone and the players that they used Mark Stone's cap space to pay. Kind of weird, huh? Florida did it, Edmonton did it, Tampa Bay did it. A lot of teams did it. But the teams that didn't use this loophole were all kind of grumpy about it. So starting in the 2027 playoffs, there's a playoff salary cap. And in a nutshell, here's kind of what it means to be. On days of playoff games, but either 5 hours before puck drop or 3 p.m., whichever is earlier, your team, if you're playing, has to file a roster with the league. And the roster has to have 2 goalies and 18 skaters. And their cap hit, with the addition of anyone whose salary you've retained, there's a formula, it gets complicated, we don't need to get into it, but retained salary, buried salary, people you've bought out, basically your cap commitments that aren't players, plus the 20 guys, 2 goalies and 18 skaters who are playing, have to be cap compliant. Now, I know what you're thinking, what if somebody gets hurt between when you name the roster and the game? You can replace them, but you need to file it with the league, and it needs to be cap compliant. And they're doing this for every day. It sounds like it'll be a pain in the ass. I'm kind of excited about it because we've all, as sports gambling has, for better or for worse, become more and more part of the ecosystem. If you're someone who wants to bet on games or on any aspect of the game, it's kind of weird that you don't know who's playing until the lineup is set after warm-up. Warm-ups are half an hour before the game. The lineup is usually set when they're going out for anthems, potentially, that late. And so if the idea is that the NHL would like to have fans gamble on the games as a way of becoming more invested in the outcomes of games, and we don't need to debate the merits of sports gambling, but one of the big complaints that people had was it's kind of insane that you're hoping to make fans and or revenue for the sport based on the outcomes of games where we might not know who's playing until up to 5 minutes before the game. So this means playoff teams will have to have things set hours in advance. And yeah, you might see a tweak because of injury or something, but the broad strokes of it is you'll kind of know who's playing. Even if, you might not know starters, you might not know lines or whatever, they might, use other kind of subterfuge to sort of maintain an edge over their opponents. But we're going to know so much earlier about playoff lineups and playoff rosters than we ever have, and they're going to be cap compliant. That's kind of cool, and I think it's going to be something that benefits the game because we're going to see a lot less weird stuff from teams before games because they don't have the ability to do as much weird stuff now, and that's kind of fun. One other thing is they've also made a tweak as to how long-term injury reserve works. Before, you could just say, Joe blows on long-term injury. You had to miss a certain amount of games. I believe it's at minimum of 10 games and or 24 days. You have to miss both, 10 games and 24 days. And then, when you're ready to come back, the doctor has to sign off and say, yeah, he's ready to go, and then you're back. While you're gone, your team is allowed to exceed the salary cap by your cap hit. When you want to come back, they have to have cap space to fit your salary back in. So the spirit of the rule was if you're a $2 million player, they could use $2 million to replace you. But when you're coming back, they have to have $2 million of space to put you back on the roster. The new rule is kind of a bit more restrictive, I think in a good way. So essentially, you are allowed to replace a player with a player or players whose aggregate salary cap is the same as the player they're replacing, but the average salary of the players replacing the injured player, has to be league average from the prior year or less. So if you have a $5 million player, you can only replace him with players who are making league average or lower from the previous season. So it's not like you can go out and replace a $5 million player with a $5 million player. That won't fly anymore. But there's an exception. So if, say, your $5 million player is out for the season, you can ask the league and the PA, hey, can we replace this guy with someone who makes more than the league average? And if they say yes, the player who is injured, who is being replaced, who you say you're going to replace for the rest of the season, is ineligible for the rest of the regular season and the playoffs. So they are flat out saying you can't pull a rabbit out of a hat in game 1 or game 2 of the playoffs and bring back an injured player off LTIR if you've used that loop, if you've used that method, and ask the PA and ask the league, can we bring in someone who makes more than the league average? So again, I kind of like this because it makes it so much more above board, and you know who can play and you know who is flat out ineligible. I assume we will be told when these guys get made ineligible. There'll be some kind of announcement, or worst case Puckpedia or Friedman or someone will say, hey, here's what's going on. But it's so much more, I think, transparent than what we've seen in the past. And again, I think it'll make the game a lot more straightforward and easy to understand during the playoffs, and just allow us to focus on the games rather than on any kind of weird chicanery regarding playoff rosters. And finally, a bit that it's not really finalized yet, but something that was included in the CBA and something that I think a lot of people are potentially excited about happening. So the usage of junior age players in the NHL is subject to the CHL transfer agreement. And the CHL transfer agreement basically is the thing that dictates, unless a player is 20, they can only play in the NHL or junior. If they're drafted out of the CHL, they're subject to the CHL's agreement. And so Zane Parekh, good example for the 25-26 season, because Zane Parekh is 19. For him, it is NHL or OHL. Those are his only options. He is not eligible to play in the American Hockey League because of his age. That might be changing. The NHL has stated within the collective bargaining agreement, within the MOU, that they're going to talk to the CHL about amending that agreement. And what they are seeking is they would like to make it so that one 19-year-old player per team has the option of going to the AHL. That's it. And it's not set yet. So I know we've seen some reporting that it's happening. We don't know that it's happening. It's probably happening, because if they didn't think it was happening, they would not have put it in the CBA. But it hasn't been confirmed yet. They are going to open up the agreement and seek to amend it with that rule. It has not been amended yet. It has not been finalized yet. But it'll probably happen. And that means that your favorite team's best prospect, who otherwise would be just ragdolling the CHL in his 19-year-old year because there's nothing else for him to do and he's not quite good enough for the NHL, there will be an intermediate step. And that means if you're an NHL team, you have other options for development of your players. If you're a prospect, you're not going to be hitting your ceiling up or hitting your head up against the ceiling in the CHL. You'll be able to keep competing. And I think we'll see fewer of these top prospects really look at the college route. Because right now, if you're I'll use Henry Muse, Flames prospect, as an example. Henry Muse has committed and will be headed in the fall to the University of Michigan as a 19-year-old because of his age. Henry Muse only had the option of playing in the NHL or the OHL during the coming season, and so the NCAA was really the only option available to him for something beyond the OHL. Henry Muse, all due respect, really good hockey player, very good kid, probably not ready for the NHL, and he probably knows that. And he's probably too good for the OHL. So do you want him to sort of stagnate in the OHL? Probably not. Right now, the NCAA is the only option available to him. If you're an NHL organization that has a crap ton of very good 19-year-olds in the CHL, you can only send one to the AHL. And so you probably still see some players take the NCAA route. I think you'll probably see, I have no idea how teams in that situation would dictate who goes to the NCAA or who goes to the AHL and who isn't given an option. That sounds like a weird thing to have to figure out. But, that's, I guess, the price of doing business if you have a lot of very good prospects in your system and you only have one AHL slot. But I think it'll allow a bit more flexibility for teams in how they manage their players. And, again, potentially you might see fewer players from the CHL going to the NCAA. They'll go to the AHL instead. So if you're the CHL, you probably still will be losing some good 19-year-olds to other levels of hockey. But, I think it'll give you a bit more flexibility. So that's pretty much the big things in the CBA that changed. In general, I kind of like the changes, and I think it'll make the game a little bit more straightforward, a little bit less complicated, a little bit less weird to understand, and especially the cap stuff. I think the LTI has always been something that frustrated people because it's complex, it's frustrating, it's written very weird to begin with, it's hard to understand, and now it'll just probably be used a lot less. And that's probably a good thing, because we'd rather people get excited about, what's happening on the ice and basic math rather than, a bunch of, legal agreements and weirdly complicated math. And, we were told that there would be no math, and sometimes there's too much math, and a little less math and a little more hockey is probably better for everybody. That's all I got for this video. Thank you very much for watching. If you like this video, please click the like button. If you really like this video, please click the subscribe button. And if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions for future videos, throw them down in the comments. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back fairly shortly. I've got a bunch of videos that I'm working through over the remainder of the season as we get into the fall. And before you know it, we'll be playing hockey and watching hockey again. In the meantime, I hope you enjoy the rest of your summer, and thanks for watching.